From the outside, Princess Charlotte seems like the picture of grace. At just 10 years old, she carries herself with a poise far beyond her years, offering quiet waves, careful curtsies, and that unmistakable air of composure that runs through the bloodline of queens. But behind palace walls, there's something else growing in Charlotte. A sharpness, a quiet awareness, and recently, something far more unsettling. Royal insiders have often described Charlotte as observant, watching, listening, absorbing more than anyone expects. While her older brother, Prince George, has the weight of the crown ahead of him, Charlotte has grown up with a different kind of freedom. It's made her watchful, perceptive, and deeply tuned in to the quiet undercurrents of palace life. And that's exactly what made her recent confession so shocking. It didn't happen in front of cameras or in a formal meeting. It wasn't a statement or a protest. It was a simple conversation. A moment of innocence that sent ripples through the palace. According to a trusted royal source, Charlotte said something quietly during a casual family moment that made her parents pause. Really pause. At first, it seemed like a child repeating something she had overheard, perhaps misunderstood. But the more William and Kate listened, the more serious it became. It wasn't just the words Charlotte used. It was the detail, the tone, the way she looked when she said it. She hadn't meant to cause trouble. She hadn't even known it was trouble. But what she said pointed directly to someone no one expected. Queen Camilla. It took a moment for the weight of that name to settle in. Could Charlotte, sweet, smiling Charlotte, have seen something the adults missed? Was it possible that in all the layers of royal protocol and politeness, it had been the youngest voice in the room who finally noticed the crack? William reportedly told aides he was deeply unsettled. Kate, known for her calm under pressure, was said to have gone completely silent. Charlotte, unaware of the reaction her words had caused, had already gone back to playing with Louis. But from that moment on, everything changed. Whispers moved through the palace. Staff became more cautious. Meetings happened behind closed doors. And slowly, piece by piece, a quiet investigation began. Because the truth was, Charlotte may have stumbled onto something the palace had tried to keep buried. Something that led not just to embarrassment, but exposure. And in the center of it all, Camilla. It started with a simple question over breakfast. Kate had been pouring orange juice when Charlotte, with the casual honesty only children possess, mentioned something that instantly made both her parents look up. "Why did Granny Camilla say that you're not supposed to tell the truth all the time?" she asked, not even realizing the storm she had just triggered. William froze. Kate blinked, setting the jug down a little harder than intended. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" she asked gently, her voice as calm as she could make it. But Charlotte was already moving on, spreading jam across toast, humming softly, like she hadn't just handed them a loaded confession wrapped in innocence. Later that day, behind closed doors and well away from listening ears, Kate brought it up again. She and William sat with Charlotte in the sunroom. No staff, no formality, just a quiet moment between parents and their daughter. This time, Charlotte gave more detail. She'd overheard a conversation, part of one at least. Camilla had been speaking with someone Charlotte didn't recognize, in a voice that sounded different, not unkind, just tense, controlling. She remembered a few phrases clearly. "They don't need to know, and keep it between us, for now." At first, William tried to brush it off as an adult conversation not meant for young ears, but Kate wasn't convinced. Charlotte's memory was clear, too clear, and it wasn't the first time she'd come home with questions about Camilla that didn't sit right. Then came the detail that shifted everything. Charlotte mentioned a letter, something Camilla had tucked away in a book after reading it quickly. Charlotte hadn't seen what it said, but the name George had been on the top line. That was enough to raise alarm bells for Kate and William both. Suddenly, this wasn't just a child's misremembered story. It was a possible clue. What was in the letter? Why had Camilla been speaking in secret about keeping things quiet? And why was Charlotte, of all people, in the room at the time? Kate later confided in a longtime aide that Charlotte's words felt like a thread coming loose in a very carefully woven tapestry. They didn't want to panic, not yet, but they knew the palace well enough to recognize one dangerous truth. If Charlotte had seen something real, and if Camilla was involved, there would be people working hard to bury it. And people like that don't hesitate, even if it means silencing a child. The walls of the palace have heard everything, scandals, secrets, and schemes, but rarely has the source of a whisper caused this much unease. And this time, it wasn't coming from a rival court or foreign press. It was coming from within, from a child. Charlotte's quiet words were now echoing in the minds of the palace's most trusted inner circle. And the name at the center of it all? Queen Camilla. It didn't make sense at first. Camilla had worked hard to craft a public image of stability, supportive of King Charles, dutiful in her engagements, warm if slightly formal with the younger royals, but behind closed doors, a different narrative was beginning to unfold. Charlotte had said too much to ignore, and the things she remembered, fragments of phrases, the glimpse of a letter, the uneasy tone in Camilla's voice, weren't the stuff of childish imagination. They were consistent, strangely specific, and far too mature to be brushed off. Kate and William brought their concerns to someone they could trust, Princess Anne. Anne, no stranger to internal royal tension, listened without interrupting. Her face stayed still, her gaze sharp. She'd heard enough palace gossip over the years to separate nonsense from a real threat. And this didn't feel like nonsense. "What exactly did she hear?" Anne asked flatly. Kate repeated Charlotte's words carefully, including the part about the letter. That was when Anne's expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough. A brief tightening of the lips, a small inhale. Something had registered. There had been rumors, months earlier, of certain private conversations Camilla had held with senior aides, conversations about roles, titles, and who deserved more public attention. At the time, it had been dismissed as harmless politics. But now, the idea that Charlotte might have overheard a plan to subtly undermine other members of the family, it couldn't be ignored. Anne leaned back in her chair, silent for a long time. Finally, she said, "If this was Camilla, and if it involved George, it's worse than we thought." She didn't elaborate. She didn't have to, because if Queen Camilla had taken steps, however small, to influence the public's perception of William and Kate's children, if she'd positioned herself as the gatekeeper of who rose and who stayed quiet, then this wasn't just a family misunderstanding. It was a manipulation of the next generation. Charlotte, unknowingly, had whispered the beginning of a storm. And if that whisper proved true, it could unravel the carefully polished image Camilla had spent years building. The royal family now had a choice: dig deeper or pretend it never happened. Princess Charlotte never meant to keep a secret. In her mind, she was simply remembering something odd, a tone, a phrase, a glance that had lingered in the back of her mind like a song she couldn't name. But the truth was, Charlotte had seen and heard more than anyone realized, and she'd carried it silently for weeks. The moment happened during a quiet afternoon in one of the smaller palace drawing rooms. Charlotte had been curled up with a book, away from the buzz of cameras and events. Nearby, Queen Camilla had entered with a private secretary, speaking in hushed voices. They hadn't noticed Charlotte, half hidden behind a floral armchair, her nose buried in the secret garden. But Charlotte noticed them. At first, their conversation didn't seem unusual. It was full of clipped phrases and formal tones, very adult and very boring. But something in Camilla's voice had caught Charlotte's attention. It was sharp, urgent, almost angry. She didn't use the gentle public voice Charlotte was used to. This one was different, and that's what made the young princess start listening more carefully. Camilla was talking about narrative control, a term Charlotte didn't fully understand, but the way she said it made it sound important. Then came a line that Charlotte remembered word for word. "She's getting too comfortable. We need to remind them who the public trusts." Charlotte didn't know who "she" was, but later, when Kate asked about the conversation she had mentioned over breakfast, Charlotte repeated those words, and that's when it all began to click for the adults around her. Later in the same overheard conversation, Camilla had taken out a letter, one she barely skimmed before slipping into the pages of a hardcover on the coffee table. Charlotte never saw the full contents, but she remembered the name on the top of the page. George. At the time, Charlotte hadn't told anyone. Not because she wanted to keep a secret, but because she didn't realize it was a secret. To her, it was just something odd adults said sometimes. But in a palace where words are weighed like gold, that passing moment became evidence. Evidence of something deeper. When she finally told Kate and William weeks later, it wasn't dramatic. It was casual, even innocent. But for the people who understood the stakes, Charlotte's quiet memory had just unlocked a hidden door. One where ambition, loyalty, and fear had been quietly brewing. A door where Queen Camilla stood on the other side. And no one, not even a child, was supposed to notice. The hardest part of being royal isn't always the public duties or the constant scrutiny. Sometimes it's what happens behind the palace doors, when you're faced with something unspoken, uncomfortable, and possibly dangerous, and you're expected to handle it silently. That was the position Prince William and Kate found themselves in. Charlotte's quiet revelation had shaken them both. It wasn't just what she had heard, it was what it might mean. Camilla's words, the mention of reminding them who the public trusts, the hidden letter with George's name, none of it sat right. But what made it worse was the possibility that Charlotte had accidentally stumbled into something political, something calculated. And now her parents had to decide, do they act or do they protect? Kate, always the steady hand, tried to keep her thoughts calm, but inside, she was reeling. She had spent years navigating the careful dance of royal diplomacy, always careful not to overstep, never giving the press more than they needed. But this wasn't about appearances. This was about their daughter. William took it even harder. Known for being fiercely protective of his children, the idea that someone, anyone, might be using them as pawns in some internal palace game made his blood boil. But Camilla wasn't a tabloid reporter or a rogue aide. She was queen consort, Charles's wife, and the second most powerful woman in the monarchy. Accusing her of manipulation? That wouldn't just stir family tensions, it could fracture the very foundation of the royal household. The couple spent days reviewing every angle. Was it possible Charlotte misunderstood? Were they reading too much into a child's observation? But the more they tried to rationalize it, the more the facts spoke for themselves. The letter, the phrasing, the secrecy. Kate, in a quiet moment, reportedly told a longtime confidant, "If we let this go, we're telling Charlotte it's okay for people to move in the shadows, and I won't do that. Not to her, not to any of them." But they knew one wrong step could explode into public scandal. If they challenged Camilla openly, the palace would close ranks. If they confronted her in private, there was no telling how she might react, or who might already be loyal to her. And then there was Charlotte. She still didn't know how serious things had become. She wasn't aware that her words had triggered a quiet crisis behind the scenes. And her innocence was part of what William and Kate were desperate to protect. Caught between a duty to the crown and their duty as parents, William and Kate were facing a terrible truth. Someone they trusted may have been willing to undermine their child for power. And if that was true, there could be no going back. When things begin to unravel behind palace walls, there's one person the royal family quietly turns to. Not for ceremony, but for clarity? Princess Anne. Anne has never needed a spotlight. She's known for her blunt honesty, her no-nonsense loyalty, and a deep understanding of what the monarchy is really made of. And when Kate and William found themselves staring down a delicate, dangerous situation, they knew exactly where to turn. Anne had seen ambition destroy relationships before. She had lived through scandals, endured betrayals, and watched the institution bend under the weight of internal power struggles. So, when Kate brought Charlotte's story to her in private, she didn't dismiss it. She listened, closely. And then she asked one question. "Do you trust your instinct on this?" Kate didn't hesitate. Yes. That was enough for Anne. She didn't need a press team, an official investigation, or a trail of memos. She needed answers, and she knew where to look. Quietly, Anne began her own inquiries. She reached out to long-serving staff she trusted, cross-checked event schedules, and followed up on the mysterious letter Charlotte had seen. Within days, small inconsistencies began to surface. A meeting that wasn't listed on official logs. A member of Camilla's staff who had been unusually evasive about access to certain documents. A sealed file, locked in the royal archives, that had been moved, then moved again. But the real breakthrough came from a junior aide who had once worked closely with Camilla. In a moment of quiet candor, they confirmed what Anne had begun to suspect. Camilla had indeed held a private meeting about the visibility of the younger royals, and Charlotte's name had come up. There was concern, the aide whispered, that the public was becoming too attached, that it was becoming the Cambridge's monarchy, not the king and queen's. Anne said nothing, but her silence spoke volumes. Now she knew. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't politics as usual. This was a direct attempt to control the narrative inside the palace, and it had targeted a child. Still, Anne also knew how dangerous this discovery was. Camilla held power. Charles trusted her, and publicly accusing the queen consort of subtle manipulation would rip through the monarchy like wildfire. But doing nothing? That was even worse. So Anne did what she's always done best. She protected the next generation, quietly, methodically, and without fanfare. She warned Kate and William to tread carefully but firmly. She let it be known, in the most polite but unmistakable terms, that she was watching, and that if there was more to uncover, she would find it. For Anne, this wasn't just about palace politics. It was about drawing a line, and Queen Camilla had just crossed it. For years, Queen Camilla had played the game of royal optics with quiet precision. She had rebuilt a public image that once teetered on scandal, carving out a role of support, stability, and subtle strength. But behind the carefully tailored coats and soft smiles was a woman who understood one unshakable truth of royal life: perception is power. And now it seemed that power had turned inward. As Anne pieced together the fragments of staff testimonies, misplaced documents, and Camilla's private meetings, a troubling picture emerged. There wasn't a single smoking gun, no signed order or blatant sabotage. But there were patterns and motives. It started with media strategy. According to an inside source, Camilla had expressed concern during several internal discussions about the shifting attention in public favor. The younger royals, particularly William and Kate's children, were drawing increasing affection from the press. Charlotte, with her quiet confidence and natural charm, had become something of a media darling, and that, Camilla had allegedly warned, could become a narrative imbalance. In plain terms, the monarchy was evolving, and the spotlight was shifting. Some senior staff members claimed Camilla had asked subtle questions about how to balance the coverage, not in an overtly hostile way, but with enough weight to suggest action. Invitations were adjusted. Charlotte was quietly excluded from one or two photo ops she'd originally been scheduled for. Articles that once highlighted the young princess's composure were replaced with fluffier pieces focusing on Camilla's own engagements. Alone, these moves seemed harmless. Together, they told a story. One aide even recalled a conversation where Camilla allegedly said, "They're lovely children, but let's not forget who's queen." It was a reminder, not just to staff, but to the institution itself, that Camilla was not a placeholder. She was the queen, and she wouldn't quietly fade behind the next generation. But what she hadn't anticipated, what no one had, was Charlotte. The child she may have seen as just another royal face had, with one innocent comment, unraveled a web of quiet influence. And in doing so, Charlotte exposed something no headline ever had: the lingering insecurity behind Camilla's crown. It wasn't that she feared Charlotte personally. It was what Charlotte represented: a future beyond Camilla's control. And in a palace where image is everything, that kind of future is the most dangerous thing of all. For a brief moment, it seemed the storm had passed. Camilla continued with her public duties as if nothing had happened. Charlotte returned to school, unaware of the flurry of whispered conversations happening just beyond her reach. But truth has a way of surfacing, especially when it's carried by someone with nothing to hide. And Charlotte, in all her innocence, spoke again. It happened during a quiet afternoon at home. William had taken the children to the gardens while Kate wrapped up a meeting. Louis was busy chasing butterflies, and George had buried himself in a book. Charlotte, as always, hovered somewhere in between, observant, curious, and unusually thoughtful for her age. "Daddy," she asked suddenly, "why did Granny Camilla say I'd forget my place?" William turned to look at her, heart sinking. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Charlotte frowned, searching for the right words. "She said it to that lady with the glasses, the one with the silver badge. I think she thought I couldn't hear her." William stayed calm, outwardly at least. But inside, everything shifted. This wasn't just a vague memory or a misunderstood sentence. Charlotte had repeated it clearly. She remembered the phrase, "Forget her place," a loaded statement by any royal standard, especially when referring to a child. Later that evening, William and Kate sat together, going over every word. This time, it wasn't a question of whether Charlotte had misheard something. It was what to do about it. Camilla had clearly made the comment. She'd done so privately, with staff present, in what she likely assumed was a moment outside of public scrutiny. But she'd underestimated the one person watching most closely: Charlotte. What stunned William and Kate wasn't just the words themselves, it was what they revealed: a mentality, a sense of hierarchy that ran deeper than etiquette. Camilla hadn't just made a comment. She'd voiced something more damaging, a belief that Charlotte didn't belong on the same level, that she needed to be reminded of her place, kept in the background. Kate, visibly shaken, reportedly told a longtime friend, "It was never about jealousy, it was about control, and our daughter was in the way." Still, they couldn't act on emotion alone. There were protocols to consider, consequences to weigh. But they knew one thing for certain now. Charlotte's words were painting a fuller picture. She hadn't simply witnessed a moment of royal tension, she had exposed a mindset. And it wasn't just inappropriate. It was calculated. Charlotte had unknowingly struck the heart of an internal power struggle. And the palace would never be the same. It began quietly: a cancelled lunch, a sudden change in protocol, then a missed engagement where Queen Camilla was noticeably absent from a family appearance. At first, the public saw only a slight shift in routine. But behind the gates of Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere had changed entirely. What had once been subtle and unspoken was now electric. cold glances, half-finished conversations, and at the center of it all, a child's confession that refused to go away. Charlotte's words had exposed something fragile, something many royals had suspected but never dared say aloud, that Camilla wasn't just navigating palace life. She was trying to reshape it. And now the royal household was splitting. Some senior aides, loyal to King Charles and Camilla, began quietly pushing back against any suggestion of wrongdoing. They dismissed Charlotte's remarks as childish misinterpretation. Others, particularly those close to William and Kate, weren't so sure. They'd seen the red flags for months: sudden reassignments, unexplainable changes to media plans, small slights that added up. Princess Anne, already alert to the signs, began asking direct questions. Not accusations, yet, but the kind of carefully phrased inquiries that made staff sweat. Charles, caught in the middle, reportedly urged calm, but his silence, however well-meaning, spoke volumes to William and Kate. There would be no top-down investigation, no public defense of their daughter. Not now, so the family fractured, quietly. Camilla, feeling the pressure, doubled down on public appearances, smiling wider, shaking more hands, hosting lunches with carefully selected press guests, but it didn't go unnoticed that her interactions with Charlotte had cooled. No more gentle hand on the shoulder, no shared smiles, just distance. William, meanwhile, became sharper, more formal. In meetings with his father, aides said he kept to official matters and little else. Kate, while maintaining her usual grace, grew more protective than ever, keeping Charlotte close, watching everything. What had once been palace routine now felt like a chessboard. The press hadn't caught on fully yet, though rumors had started to swirl. Headlines hinted at behind-the-scenes tension and unexpected coolness between households. But no one outside the palace knew how serious it had become. And still, Charlotte remained blissfully unaware of the firestorm swirling around her. Her words, spoken without agenda, had revealed a power struggle years in the making. Now, those in power had a choice. They could defend the integrity of the institution, or continue pretending nothing had happened. But one thing was certain: the palace would never go back to what it was before. Because when a child speaks the truth, even the most gilded walls can start to crack. The Queen had always been skilled at appearances, knowing when to step forward and, more importantly, when to step back. But this time, her retreat wasn't just strategic, it was personal. After whispers of tension began swirling throughout the palace, Camilla's public engagements quietly began to shift. She was no longer the ever-present consort by Charles's side at every event. Instead, she began to pull away, subtly but unmistakably. No one announced it. There was no official statement, no front-page headline. But royal observers noticed Camilla was suddenly on holiday more often. A long weekend in Gloucestershire, a quiet retreat to Raymill House, a last-minute cancellation at a joint appearance with the king. To some, it looked like a woman seeking peace. To others, it looked like someone avoiding consequences. Inside the palace, staff were more divided than ever. Loyalists in Camilla's camp tried to spin her withdrawal as gracious, an effort to de-escalate family friction and avoid distracting the public. But those closest to William and Kate saw it differently. "She's not stepping back," one courtier was overheard saying. "She's shielding herself." Princess Anne, who had now become a quiet force behind the scenes, wasn't buying the retreat narrative either. She knew Camilla well enough to know this wasn't surrender. It was repositioning, waiting, watching. Meanwhile, Kate and William remained publicly composed but privately unsettled. They'd hoped Camilla might acknowledge the situation, perhaps even address it behind closed doors. Instead, she vanished from the conversation completely, refusing to confront or clarify, leaving a silence that felt louder than any statement. And it was in that silence that the damage deepened. By choosing not to respond, not even to acknowledge what Charlotte had overheard, Camilla had made her position painfully clear. Whether she meant the words or not, she wasn't going to explain them. Whether the comment about Charlotte forgetting her place had been said in passing or in calculation, it would remain unaddressed. For William and Kate, that silence spoke volumes. If it had been anyone else, any aide, any advisor, there would have been consequences. But this was the queen consort, and in royal tradition, queens are not questioned. But Charlotte wasn't tradition. She was the future, and that made Camilla's silence feel less like discretion and more like dismissal. The palace moved on, as it always does, but the rift remained, carved deeper by every unspoken word. Camilla may have retreated, but the memory lingered, not just in the minds of the royals, but in the quiet observations of a little girl who had seen more than anyone expected. And sometimes it's the silence after the storm that reveals who was really at the center of it all. After the charity event concluded successfully, Princess Anne felt a wave of relief, but also rising anger. Charlotte had been saved, but the fact that a child had to be protected from people inside the palace was deeply unsettling. Anne knew she couldn't let this slide. Quietly, and without drawing public attention, she arranged a private meeting with the core conspirators. She didn't come in yelling. Anne presented her evidence, emails, meeting records, and manipulated event documents, with her usual calm but piercing precision. The culprits couldn't deny their roles, their justification. They feared the younger generation, especially Charlotte, was a threat to traditional values and royal hierarchy. In other words, they saw her rising popularity as a risk to their own control. Anne was disgusted. They had almost ruined a child's public image to serve their own ambition. But rather than go public, which would have dragged Charlotte into more scrutiny, she made a calculated choice. The conspirators were immediately reassigned, far from any influence over royal events, and blacklisted from sensitive roles. Their actions were recorded in sealed royal archives, but Anne's decision came at a cost. Whispers within palace walls began to circulate. Some staff felt Anne had overstepped, others secretly applauded her. She became more isolated, burdened by the weight of what she knew. Even her relationship with King Charles strained slightly. After all, some of those involved were longtime palace loyalists. Charlotte, blissfully unaware, continued on as her bright, confident self. The event became a turning point for her. She gained praise for her poise and earned the quiet admiration of the royal family. Anne, meanwhile, reflected privately. She had once again protected the crown, but more importantly, she had protected a child. And for her, that would always come first.